So, you know, are you managing the company for your other stakeholders, like the employees? So if you have a family dispute and the company goes into liquidation, what about all those employees who've lost their jobs? So it's not just the family involved, it's everybody else involved as well. Now, here's a quote, one of my PhD students from Uganda, who's now a vice-chancellor in Uganda, says, you know, people might disobey their direct bosses because basically they're one of the family. So if you bring in general managers and people to run businesses, how do you know that the family members also working in the company aren't going to undermine what the general manager is trying to do? And another PhD student of mine from Saudi Arabia, when an owner wants to have a representative on the board, well, just appoint a member of the family. Forget what qualifications or experience, it's the family that matters. So I said here about there's high ownership concentration, and you have a free rider problem, because if you're a small minority shareholder, you don't bother to go to annual meetings, you don't bother to vote, because you know, what's the point? You know, you've got such little influence that you just let everybody else and all the other shareholders get on with it. I have personal investments in, you know, a number of companies listed in the UK, mainly. I never ever vote for anything at shareholders' meetings, because I know I am just such a fraction when compared to all the institutions who basically own 75% of the shares. What's the point? My vote doesn't even count. So I'm a free rider. I free ride on the institutions. And what about voice or exit? As a shareholder, all you can do is you can complain and make a noise about it, which is what the activist investors do, or you sell your shares. So you just have to sell your shares, because me, as a small shareholder, no one's going to listen to me. The only thing I've got to do is sell my shares. But in the UK, that's very, very easy. But I believe in some countries, it's not that easy to sell your shares. You know, they might be very illiquid, or there might be rules and things that might not make it able for you to sell. Also, I believe in this area of the world, you have voting shares and non-voting shares, which in the UK we don't have. All shares, it's one share, one vote. So if you hold non-voting shares, how do you value those shares? How will you ever be able to sell those shares if there is no value for them? So, you know, you've got this two-tier structure of shareholders. There's existence of pyramid structures. This is different from the pyramid schemes that we heard about this morning. This is the pyramid structures within companies, where companies own shares in other companies, which own shares in other companies, which own shares in other companies. And at the end of the day, you actually don't know where the control of the final corporation is, because there's so many cross-shareholdings, there's so many other family holdings. France is a key country where this is very, very prevalent, where it's sometimes very, very hard to work out who the ultimate owners of companies are. So we have often in this area, we have civil law codes. It's generally thought that common law countries have better corporate governance practices than those with civil codes. Weak judicial system, so poor enforcement, lack of the independence of judges, poor protection of minority interests, lack of openness and transparency, I'll mention that again in a minute, and few cross-listings, i.e. how many companies listed on the stock markets here also have a listing in the US or the UK. And if you have a listing in another country, often your governance practices are better than you have a listing on just one country. What about lack of board experience? So how about board evaluation? We heard that in the last session. Some board members boasting no one would ever evaluate them. They're far too important to be evaluated. So who is going to evaluate these people? So what are we going to do about evaluating boards and individual directors? I believe here you have shadow and alternate directors, which again we do not have in the UK. And there's a question over the independence of executive directors. And do they spend enough time on company business? If you've got someone who's on, say, 5 different boards, how do they find enough time to spend on the business of those 5 different companies? So are they spending enough time on them? Now, in Colombia, there's various codes that I think you're all aware of. And, come on. And what I've done is try to distill, some of them are slightly different and whatever, but to distill some of the key features. Now, most of you would probably know all of these, but first of all, there should be between 5 and 9 members. And for most companies, that's fine. But supposing you've got a very, very complex, big company with lots of subsidiaries, you need to have the experience and whatever on the board. And with 9 directors, when you bear in mind that some of them might be, you know, there for various other reasons, sometimes you might want more than 9. So should 9 be the maximum? You've got the separation of the chairman and the CEO. Now, in the UK, the CEO is often the most powerful person in the corporation. And for what I understand here, the translation of that here is the general manager. And the general manager often isn't actually even a board member. So your situation here is so different from the one that I'm used to from the UK and in the US. The CEO is all-powerful, and that would be the equivalent of your general manager being all-powerful. So I don't think that's necessarily the situation here. Something that really surprised me was this average age. Now, one of the documents I read said that all directors had to be within that age, but now I think the average board age has to be between 55 and 65 years. But you're missing out on a whole, board diversity is the key at the moment. If you look at the US, UK, we're all looking at diversity of boards. We want people from different ethnic groups, different religions. We want women on the boards. So what you're doing by saying, well, your board must be of this age, then is that really what you want? You're missing out on all those youngsters. I mean, think about your children. My children, one of my daughters is on the internet every single night. She's into all the latest gadgets, all the technology. And I mean, if I'm on a board, say, I'm not yet 55, so I wouldn't be allowed to be on a board, but if I was, I don't understand what teenagers are doing, or 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds are doing. So you're missing out on all of that if the average age of the board has got to be, 55 to 65. And also you might have a president who's 80. I mean, you think of Rupert Murdoch, he would fall on the codes that you have here. So you need to think about, well, what diversity of board do you have? Yeah. How about the directors, committees? We've already seen common in the US and the UK. We have 3. Well, we have the audit committee, the nomination committee, and the remuneration committee. We have those 3 committees. And it was quite surprising to see how few companies in Colombia have an audit committee. No self-respecting company in the UK or US would not have an audit committee. What about disclosure, risk and control? Well, one of them things is maybe adopt international financial reporting standards. And one thing that struck me was auditor rotation every 5 years. Another thing that you come down to is corporate social responsibility. This is, I think, where you are ahead of most Western parts of the world, because we don't have this enshrined in our corporate governance codes. I mean, this is something like an add-on. So the fact that you really care about these things is another thing where you could attract international overseas investors.